Well, John, thank you very much indeed for giving us your time here for the Jerome Moross centenary, for our documentary celebrating the 100th anniversary of the birth of this wonderful artist who, although he is, of course, famous for the film The Big Country, is nothing like as well known as he should be for the wonderful work that he did not only in other films but in other genres. And I think that's one of the things that's terribly important for us to look into in this documentary. I think it would be a very useful starting point from your vantage to ask you your own response to the breadth and diversity of his very inventive creativity across the board.
Well, let me put it this way. I love what you're saying, and I think it's absolutely accurate because Jerome Moross is not, in fact, a Hollywood composer. He spent part of his career in Hollywood, and he wrote some extraordinary film scores. But in fact, he had a wonderfully diverse career that spent part of its time in the theater, and part of its time in the concert hall, and part of its time writing for dramatic radio, and part of its time in Hollywood doing what we now think of as classic film scores. So it was quite a diverse career overall. What I always try to tell my students at the University of Southern California is to remember that overall, what he offered us was a great new look at music of America by an American. And I think this really found its best expression through the film scores. I adore the symphony, and I adore Frankie and Johnny and the ballet ballads, and the Golden Apple, of course, is a masterpiece of American theater. But I especially love the film scores because he really reinvented the sound of the West for Hollywood films.
Yes, and it's amazing to think, isn't it, that with that tremendous influence that he cast over the entire film music scene, it's extraordinary to think that in his early times in Hollywood, he was not liked at all by the authorities. I think I'm right in saying that they thought he was too avant-garde, and he had quite a tough time there, and it took him some time to become established.
Well, I think what you need to remember is that from the beginning, music written for Hollywood films was a bit of a closed shop in that it was primarily dominated by European composers, Max Steiner from Vienna, Erich Korngold, also from Austria, Miklos Rozsa from Hungary, Dmitri Tiomkin from Russia. So many of these composers, and they really kind of dominated the sound of American films, especially in the 1930s and 40s. So Aaron Copland was invited to Hollywood because he was already Aaron Copland, and therefore somewhat in demand simply because he was already a fairly famous name in American concert music. But someone like Jerome Moross, who was not well known, might be looked at and heard as somebody who's, not exactly our type, not exactly a traditional orchestral composer in the way that we know it. So I think that's probably why he wound up orchestrating rather than composing for his first 10 years or so in Hollywood.
Well, yes, I've always felt, and it comes across strongly in the interviews that we have of Jerome Moross that we're able to use for this documentary, I've always felt strongly that he was very much his own man, by which I mean that he felt the most important element of his life was to write music that came from his heart, from his mind, of course, as well, because he was a wonderfully disciplined and self-educated musician, but that the motive was artistic, so that in the film studios it was the same as anything. The music had to be inspired by a subject that he felt an affinity with, and the music came out of him pursuing his aspiration to portray the truth of the dramatic situation on the film. I'm not saying that other film composers who were around in Hollywood at the time didn't do that, but he was not thinking so much of the financial and commercial side. He was his own man, and stylistically, I think that's one of the things that's so interesting that makes him so individualistic.
Yes, I understand what you're saying. I think that what I find fascinating about Moross's career is that from the very beginning, I mean, he was fairly young when he met people like Henry Cowell and Charles Ives and Aaron Copland, and seemed to, from the very early days, I mean, by the late 1930s, by the time he's writing Frankie and Johnny, he has already incorporated the sounds of Americana into his own music. And that seems to me to require a great deal of confidence moving forward. I mean, you're really taking American music in a fresh direction at that point. And he was awfully young to be doing that. And while, as we say, he did not become as famous as his colleague and friend Aaron Copland, what he was doing, I think, was in many ways as important in helping to define a brand new sort of American idiom in the concert hall.
Yes, very much so. John, I wonder if you agree with me, though, that despite the fact that he defined this American quality so strongly, actually in very many ways, so did Copland, as we know, in very many ways he was so different from Copland. And I have often wondered whether Jerome Moross has not become as famous as Copland, for one reason being that he is a very difficult composer to pigeonhole. I don't mean that it's easy to pigeonhole Copland, or wise to pigeonhole any composer, of course not. But I feel with Moross, the difference is that he had a very extraordinary diversity in his overview of what he was expressing. There are so many different elements of American experience in his music. And I wonder whether, in that respect, it's again, I'm possibly on dangerous ground here, because Copland too, as we know, had a wonderful diversity here. But I'm wondering whether there is almost a kind of broader and more complex spectrum somewhere in Moross, even a suggestion sometimes, for me, of his background, the roots of his background, going back to his European ancestors, that makes, for all the absolutely unmistakable Americanism of his music, actually makes him not a more complex experience, but a very, very subtle, something that is so diverse and so many-sided that maybe he's been the victim of the pigeonholing age that we've been living in for quite some time. I wonder whether you think that there's any truth in what I said there.
I have struggled with this myself for years, especially trying to explain it to my students at USC. What I find in Moross's music, it begins, it seems to me, by his insistence on incorporating all kinds of American popular music, jazz, blues, ragtime, stomps, into his own language, his own musical language. And then we delve into that even more deeply in the film scores, when you find an incredible energy and a wonderful sort of melodic sense, often derived from what we think of as folk tunes here in America, the sort of folk tradition, but with a great rhythmic underpinning, all of which says America and the American West to me. There's something indigenous, there's something inherent in the Moross way of writing music that I think is undeniably American, and I don't like to compare it to Copland. I think the two of them were sort of in the same direction, moving in the same way. It's just that I find that what Moross achieved is something that's undoubtedly inherently American in terms of musical grammar and language.
Can I just suggest that something that is so important in his music is, within that context that you have so clearly and so lucidly described for us there is such depth. I'd mentioned the diversity and breadth of his compositions before, but it really, I think, is amazing, which I think is very American, if I may say so. It has the exuberance, the openness of America. But there's such beauty, there's poignancy, there's sadness. There is, to me, melancholy so much. It's not a self-indulgent melancholy, but it's a poignant and touching one that's there all the time. I think that's what marks him out particularly, especially as a very individual composer. Americana, yes, but human. I don't mean that other American composers are not human, but he's very human in a very subtle and broad way, don't you think?
Well, I think your point is well taken. I think it's very interesting. I certainly can't wait now to hear the final version of the program because I'm certainly looking forward to hearing how you put that in. Here's what I would say about Moross, and I come to this because of my appreciation and long study, I think, of the film scores. What Moross was able to do, particularly in the film scores, is to not only apply his very special brand of American music, but also to incorporate a level of emotion that we don't often hear in the concert world. Because what we're talking about here are film scores which essentially are there to help provide and stimulate the emotional qualities of what we're seeing and hearing, what you've got here is a very sensitive man who is able to take what he already knows how to do, which is to write great orchestral music, but also apply it in a very emotional way. Any film score necessarily has to give you a sense of the place and the time, but its most important job is to elicit an emotional response from the viewer. And I think that Moross does that better than many in his time, particularly in the 1950s and 60s. And so he's able to take his training and abilities as a composer, but also apply them in a way that elicits the right kind of emotion, whether it's sadness or joy or terror or suspense, or simply play out the great big skies of the American West. He found a way to do that in ways that perhaps were more effective even than those of Copland before him in Copland's very few films.
Well, wasn't he responding to what he saw and what he read and what he imagined, all surrounding the scenery, the ambience, and the characters. And I think that was what made the film scores, they are all so different because he is reflecting the difference in the people and the places. It's a wonderful identity with the literary and dramatic and scenic reality of what he's setting to music.
I think it's true, and I would add that although he didn't write that many film scores, we don't think of him in the way that we think of a Max Steiner or an Alfred Newman, whose film scores numbered in the hundreds. What he did do shows a surprising versatility. When you go from the Cuban rhythms of the Shark Fighters to the medieval sounds of the Warlord and the sort of Chinese modes incorporated into the Mountain Road and the boisterous Americana of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, that's a surprising range and a fun level of music as well. If you take all of those and listen to them, they're all of a piece in the sense that they're all by the same composer, and yet they demonstrate a remarkable range of writing.
And that was despite difficult conditions, wasn't it? Often editors interfering, music that he'd written being used for different purposes, and yet so much of the real endemic feeling and quality of what he was describing in the text and on the screen is maintained, I feel, in all those scores. Of course, The Big Country is his most famous, isn't it? And, it'd be interesting to hear from you perhaps why you feel that was so particularly successful, let's just say.
You know perhaps better than I that The Big Country in 1958 really shook up the status quo in Hollywood music, in the sense that we had had many, many Westerns before The Big Country, but we had never really had an authentic American sound accompanying them. This is what Jerome Moross accomplished with The Big Country, which is interesting in the sense that director William Wyler never really liked the music that he got for his film and always kind of poo-pooed it. But I must tell you, William Wyler, as great a director as he was a complete idiot when it came to music for his films. Here's a man who got an Oscar-winning score for The Best Years of Our Lives by Hugo Friedhofer, and he hated it. Here's a man who had Miklos Rozsa on Ben-Hur and tried to get him to use Silent Night over the scenes of the Nativity, which luckily Rozsa was able to resist and avoid. And Wyler's attitude toward Moross on the Big Country was always fairly negative. And so I really believe that Wyler, unfortunately, as great a director as he was not particularly smart about music. As you know, he wanted Aaron Copland for the Big Country, and Copland turned him down, having decided that he had already accomplished what he wanted to in that particular genre. I mean, by that time, of course, he'd written Billy the Kid and Rodeo and scores for Of Mice and Men and The Red Pony, and so he may have felt that way. Well, thank God, because Jerome Moross wrote a masterpiece in the Big Country, and to this day, perhaps the greatest Western film score ever written.
And would you say perhaps that although it's nothing like as famous and the film was nothing like as successful, but just from a musical point of view, would you also say that equally important artistically in its individuality and its greatness of quality is the score for The Warlord? Would you feel that?
I do think that The Warlord is one of the great Moross scores. For a film that's really kind of sadly forgotten, of course, it's a Charlton Heston epic set in medieval times. He not only sets the time and place musically, we immediately are sort of plunged into that far away time and place, but also there's a wonderful love theme in that score that I've always liked. My memory is that, as usual in Hollywood, they ran out of time and actually had to enlist a second composer to come in and do some of those sequences. But the majority of the score is, in fact, Moross's, and it is a great album.
Can we just have a look at some of the stage works, John? I was astonished the very first time I heard Frankie and Johnny, because when I realised that this was written in 1938, I felt I was hearing something that could have been written almost 20 years later, because there's such a tension and anxiety in it. It does feel to me that it's portraying that kind of very dark, nervous, exciting, but anxious quality that we often hear in the 1950s in Leonard Bernstein's music. So ahead of its time, and listening to it now, it's not dated.
Yeah, indeed. Frankie and Johnny was, I think, striking in its originality in 1938. And again, an indication that Moross had, I think, an amazing level of confidence as a young composer. And of course, Frankie and Johnny sets the mold for future Moross works that combine aspects of jazz and blues and dance music of the time, ragtime, and of course traditional concert music, traditional orchestral sounds. But taking this sort of classic American folk tale, which was in and of itself fairly edgy, shall we say, and then turning it into a fascinating ballet with the great Ruth Page, was daring and risky in its time, and as you say, not dated at all.
You mention Ruth Page there. It's very important, isn't it, to acknowledge and understand that Jerome Moross was extremely demanding in who he worked with for stage works. That's to say, a choreographer like Ruth Page, and famously later on, a lyricist such as John Latouche. These were a small number of people that he felt happy to work with, because he was very demanding, wasn't he, to have somebody that had the same artistic outlook that he did, had the similar kind of social outlook that he had, and the same kind of feeling about society and the subjects that were being set. And I think this is a very important reason why those theatre works are so particularly successful. We think of course, John Latouche and Jerome Moross with A Golden Apple, but also with Ruth Page and Frankie and Johnny, as you've just described to us. It's part of the same issue, isn't it, of looking for the absolute truth in what he was doing, because for him, the music that he was composing for these theatrical works, this wasn't an accompaniment music, it was the integral part of the complete theatrical experience, which is why he had to be working with the right person to make it perfect for him.
Jerome Moross loved the theater, and he liked collaborating with other artists, I believe. Even though he was a brilliant composer and could sit in a dark room and scribble notes that we would all find miraculous days or weeks or months later, he did like working in the theater. And I think, the classic example of that to me is The Golden Apple, where you have an extraordinary concept, great music, remarkable lyrics, fabulous performances, and a groundbreaking use of kind of Broadway plus opera plus musical comedy. You have all of these elements and all working together. And it really does go back to the Frankie and Johnny success of 1938, and he sort of ramps up through the 1940s into the early 1950s so that it really sort of explodes onto the scene in The Golden Apple in 1954, which to me is a kind of unheralded masterpiece in the history of Broadway, a show that should be revived, but never is because it's so expensive to mount, which is really kind of a shame. But those people who witnessed it, who saw those performances, or who were in fact a part of the cast, like Kay Ballard, who luckily is still with us, talk about it in amazing terms, in glowing, remarkable terms.
Well, we have Kay Ballard as a contributor to our documentary. That was wonderful speaking with her. She was, as you have just pointed out, tremendously impassioned about The Golden Apple. For her, it was clearly a unique experience. And also contributing to our documentary is an interesting man, Ian Marshall Fisher. Now, I have a reason why I want to mention his interview. Ian Marshall Fisher was the creator and is the general director of an organisation called Lost Musicals. They put on, from time to time, musicals, performances of musicals that have been neglected, forgotten, or even lost. And here in England, he put on a performance of The Golden Apple some years back. And because of this, I was rather intrigued to know how it went down, and I was keen to know whether he felt that there could be a revival, and I asked him also why the work has fallen into neglect and why it couldn't be revived today. And he said he thought that the subject matter and the entire sophisticated ambience of the piece, even in 1954, was pretty demanding for an audience, but that he felt that today's audiences that go to musicals would find The Golden Apple far too intellectually demanding for them. In other words, for today's audience, it would be too much work to get involved with finding out about the Greek mythology, and for that matter, even the American history. But I think, despite that, it would be a tremendous success in an opera house today. Opera houses in the last 20 years have sometimes performed works that have been, shall we say, pigeonholed, if I may use that word again, as musicals. But of course, The Golden Apple is more of an opera than a musical, and I think it would be a tremendous success today in an opera house. I mean, do you think so?
No, I think you're right. I think you're exactly right. It's just as Sweeney Todd has now found a home in an opera house, so should The Golden Apple. It is a sophisticated show, and yet those who saw it in 1954 remembered how entertaining and fun it was, too. I think that if The Golden Apple were to be done properly and the right investment made in it, I think it could be a hit today. I think it really could succeed if it was done under the right circumstances. Let me make one other point, if I can. The Golden Apple and The Big Country and Frankie and Johnny all demonstrate how much ahead of his time Jerome Moross was. He was attempting to do things no one else had done before on the ballet stage, in the opera world, in the film world. And I think in many cases it was not sufficiently appreciated at the time. And one hopes that the legacy will live on and that these things will be appreciated. And I'm just so delighted that attention seems to be being paid in his centennial year to these extraordinary works.
Yes, and we mustn't forget the fabulous work that Susanna Moross has done in recent years to work up to this centenary year in communications that are enabling many performances to take place. It's very, very exciting and rewarding that her work has led to so many marvellous artists and organisations actually feeling as enthusiastic as you and I do about having his music performed. That's the marvellous thing. Well, John, thank you very much indeed. It's been marvellous to have you take part in this centenary documentary. Is there anything else that you would like to say, anything I've not asked that I should have done?
I don't know. I think one more point I might want to make, and this deals with the big country a little bit, and I'm sure you're going to have plenty on that, but I do want to say, just in case nobody else says it, that prior to 1958, the Western scores in Hollywood tended to be like Max Steiner or Dmitri Tiomkin. Dmitri Tiomkin, for example, Russian-born, did like the folk music style. He would tend to begin with a sort of faux cowboy song, as in High Noon, and expand on that orchestrally. Max Steiner, for example, would also take old cowboy tunes. You'll hear them in scores like Dodge City or They Died with Their Boots On. But at the end of the day, these were European composers applying what they understood and knew to westerns made in Hollywood. But when Moross came along and infused his films, particularly The Big Country, with a homegrown Americana, an American composer applying American musical vernacular to these films, it really changed everything. After The Big Country, westerns really needed to be rethought musically. And so when Elmer Bernstein came along with The Magnificent Seven and his films later in the 1960s, he owed a great debt, and in fact acknowledged this, owed a great debt to what Moross had done by opening the door with The Big Country in 1958.
And in doing so, proved how ridiculous William Wyler had been to dismiss it. We have an interview with Jerome Moross in which he recalls receiving a telegram from William Wyler absolutely decimating the score. Just ridiculous. Amazing, isn't it? Well, thank you very much, Jon Burlingame, indeed. Thank you very much indeed for giving us your invaluable expertise on Jerome Moross for our centenary celebration. It's been delightful talking with you. Thank you ever so much.
Thanks, John. Bye.